Just as our mysterious Professor S.H.I.E.L.D found a trans-dimensional loophole, he landed squarely in the Marvel Universe, immediately attracting S.H.I.E.L.D's attention. But Schiller is no ordinary psychiatrist. He's a master manipulator who weaponized his own fabricated desperation to outplay Nick Fury himself. Recognizing Tony Stark's psychological fragility, Schiller didn't use force. He used a single, perfectly aimed truth about pepper pots to emotionally dismantle the genius billionaire. His prize, a clinic in Hell's Kitchen, a chaotic nest perfect for a predator. This isn't Gotham's theatrical madness, it's a primal urban jungle. Schiller established his dominance not with fists, but with a prototype fear toxin from the DC Universe, turning his clinic into forbidden ground and driving local thugs insane by forcing them to confront their own sins. This chilling display of psychological warfare inevitably drew out the local guardian, Daredevil. But even the man without fear was completely outmatched. Schiller didn't just know his secret identity, he methodically deconstructed Matt Murdock's entire vigilante crusade, leaving the hero disarmed and questioning his own purpose. Schiller isn't just a new player, he's rewriting the rules of engagement, proving the most dangerous villain is the one who holds a mirror to your soul. Gotham's morning, as always, was saturated with a pervasive smog and a cold, chilling rain. Schiller sat up in bed and stretched, a series of fine, sharp cracks echoing from his joints. He had just extricated himself from the cacophony of the Marvel Universe and had yet to enjoy more than a few days of peace before the specters of S.H.I.E.L.D once again materialized near his clinic. To an ordinary person, those agents were an inexorable nightmare. Even a billionaire like Tony Stark could do little more than complain futilely about their endless harassment. But Schiller was different. When Gotham's fledgling Batman began to vex him, he could vanish in an instant, crossing over to the Marvel Universe to watch the ensuing chaos from a safe distance. And now, as S.H.I.E.L.D, as scrutiny grew too intense, he could slip back just as quietly, letting Gotham's gray rain become his finest sanctuary. The S.H.I.E.L.D agents found nothing. Schiller's departure had left no physical trace. No plane ticket, no train fare, not a single frame of him on any surveillance footage. This uncanny disappearance only served to deepen Nick Fury's conviction that the psychology professor was far from simple. Back in the DC Universe, his colleague, the future Scarecrow Jonathan Crane, remained wholly engrossed in his fear experiments, oblivious to the samples stolen from his lab. Schiller was not greedy. He had taken no more than the contents of a single small test tube. He was not, after all, a madman bent on acts of terror. Against a few low-level street thugs, such a small amount was more than sufficient. He required no high-tech diffusion device. A simple, inconspicuous atomizer, aimed at a target's mouth and nose at close range, would transform the concentrated fear toxin into a devastating weapon. The dregs who scraped by in dark alleys, after all, could hardly possess the willpower or reflexes of the Batman. While studying his spoils, Schiller discovered an interesting secret. Despite his lack of systematic chemical knowledge, his keen intuition told him that this first-generation version of the gas was impure. Beyond inducing fear, it could catalyze other, more complex negative emotions. To a psychologist, this was nothing short of a godsend. When a patient stubbornly sealed off their psyche, what tool could be better than a key that could pry open an emotional fissure directly? A more audacious plan began to form in his mind. He diluted the fear toxin several hundred times and, as if mixing a perfume, lightly spritzed it onto his collar and cuffs. For reasons he could not divine, perhaps some inherent immunity, the gas had no effect on him, yet it could infect those who drew near with a subtle, almost imperceptible thread of negative emotion. He prepared this invisible weapon for his most naive student, Bruce Wayne, Gotham's future Dark Knight. The Batman of this moment was far from the master strategist and dark detective he would one day become. Bruce was too young, fresh from a global pilgrimage of hardship, his skills and fury desperately seeking an outlet. He had donned a crude, first-generation suit, grabbed a few batarangs, and plunged headfirst into Gotham's abyss of crime. In his mind, the equipment forged with billions was a guarantee of victory. He had not yet realized that what truly forged the Batman were not those cold contraptions, but the unyielding, scorched landscape of his own psyche. Bruce's path to growth was destined to be long and painful, and Schiller, for the sake of his own quiet life in Gotham, felt compelled to intervene ahead of schedule to assume the role of the young hero's psychological mentor. Their chance encounter in the rainy night had been only yesterday. Schiller remembered it clearly, the flicker of astonishment on Bruce's face when he had spoken his name, but nothing more. The young man's understanding of the world had long surpassed that of ordinary people. He had seen powers, witnessed magic. He knew that beneath the curtain of reality, countless prying eyes lay hidden. A knock, firm and steady, sounded at the clinic door. Schiller's voice carried through the wood, tinged with a lazy amusement. "Come in." Outside, Bruce felt an inexplicable sense of relief. The swift reply meant the person within had anticipated his arrival and, moreover, was willing to speak with him. Batman loathed all forms of deliberate mystification. Schiller's forthrightness, at least, promised a candid dialogue, not a labyrinth of verbal games. He pushed the door open. The clinic was as dim and quiet as ever, the only rhythm the steady beat of rain against the windowpane. Bruce sat down on the familiar sofa and studied the man opposite him. "Professor," he began, "you seem to be in good spirits today." Schiller's gaze fell on his tense shoulders and slightly furrowed brow. A playful curve touched his lips. "And you, Mr. Wayne, appear to be in a rather poor mood." He gestured with an open hand toward the empty coffee cup on the table. "I thought you might offer to pour me a cup, as you did the first time. I made a point of saving you the opportunity this morning." Bruce was silent for a moment, a flicker of conflict in his eyes, but he rose nonetheless and walked to the counter. To Schiller, tasting coffee brewed by the Batman himself was a collectible curiosity of the highest order. To Bruce, however, it was undoubtedly a precise psychological test, a technique of using verbal commands to compel obedience. The thought, he had to admit, fit his profile of Schiller perfectly, a mad scholar obsessed with mental manipulation. Schiller took a sip of the warm coffee, the Gotham chill instantly dispelled. He waited. He knew Bruce would be the one to speak first. "Why were you there last night?" "I don't know what you mean," Schiller replied, his tone light. "If you intended to hide, you shouldn't have let me see your face." Bruce's voice was low and sharp. "It's too late for denials." Schiller set the cup back on the table with a soft, sharp click that echoed in the quiet room. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "I never denied that you saw me. I simply want to ask you, Bruce Wayne, why a man with a fortune of tens of billions chooses not to establish charitable foundations, but instead dresses up in a ridiculous skin-tight suit to play boxing games with street thugs in the Gotham rain." The question struck Bruce's silence like a sledgehammer. "This is not a question you need to think about." Schiller's voice turned cold, precise. "Because I will answer it for you." He paused, dissecting him word by word. "Because your fundamental purpose is not salvation, it's vengeance." "That's the answer you've given me," Bruce retorted. "No, I have merely read the answer in your own heart. I don't believe in mind-reading." "Of course there's no such thing as mind-reading," Schiller said, leaning back in his chair, his posture relaxing. "It's simply that some people fail to realize that their desires, so intense they have become twisted, are screaming out through every minute expression and gesture. People think they hide their inner selves so well. In reality, it is merely self-deception." A flicker of desire crossed Bruce's eyes. Can I learn this skill, the ability to see through people, and use it to better exact your revenge on criminals? Schiller asked, a note of pity in his voice. You're oversimplifying things, Bruce. Vengeance may be your starting point, but if you allow it to become your sole fuel, your end will be exactly the same as it was last night. Schiller made a sharp, plunging gesture with his hand. Bruce immediately began to explain. After I got back last night, I added a cape to the armor and designed a multi-function belt. Schiller cut him off. You know, none of that is the point. You can add 1,000 pounds of hydraulic power to your gauntlets. You can install moon landing engines in your boots. You could even build yourself a pair of wings and fly to any corner of the solar system. I believe you can do it, Bruce. For you, these things are trivial. His voice turned abruptly to ice. But it won't be enough. Not nearly enough. If I had that kind of power, I could eliminate every criminal in the world, couldn't I? Bruce's tone was filled with a mixture of arrogance and confusion. Schiller sighed softly. This Batman, who had not yet met the Joker, how could he possibly understand how a madman with no powers, only a few circus tricks and a small knife, could drag a superhero, a master of 100 fighting styles and armed to the teeth, into a psychological hell time and time again? In the history of Batman's development, Schiller considered himself an associate professor at best. The true lecturer, the mentor who would teach him all his most painful lessons, was likely still living in obscurity in some third-rate circus. Beneath a veneer of humility and a thirst for knowledge, the Bruce before him was wrapped in an unshakable arrogance. He sought to learn psychology from Schiller just as he had collected martial arts from around the world, merely to add a new weapon to his arsenal. Schiller responded calmly, as I said, you are of course welcome to study psychology, attend my lectures, memorize the textbook, complete the assignments, and pass the final exam. As a professor, I will never turn away a student who seeks knowledge. You know that's not what I want to learn. Then what short-cut do you imagine there is? Your special ability? Bruce gestured vaguely. I've met many people like you in my travels, people with powers beyond normal comprehension. No, Schiller denied it flatly. I am not like them. I possess no abilities that transcend the ordinary. Bruce fell into thought, his lips pressed into a thin line. He clearly didn't believe a word of it, but this young Batman was far too green. His thoughts were direct, impulsive, his actions hasty, with no regard for consequences. The previous night's failure had only amplified his anxiety. He was desperate to obtain some kind of mind-reading weapon from Schiller, something that would give him the upper hand against criminals instead of being taken down by a handful of lime powder and shoved off a building. He had not even begun to understand the root cause of his failure. This time, too, Bruce left empty-handed. Schiller had only told him, in a near-threatening tone, that he had best attend all his classes and earn a good grade on the final. Bruce, it was clear, had not heard a single word. As night fell, Schiller went out again. He moved like a nocturnal animal familiar with its territory, slipping into Jonathan's secret laboratory. This time he took more of the fear gas. Glaring gaps now appeared in the 2 racks of test tubes. Even someone as obtuse as Jonathan would have to notice that his life's work was being carted away by an invisible thief. Schiller lacked the ability to improve the formula. All he could do was transfer the dangerous liquids into different containers or perform simple dilutions. But there was one other thing he could do. He could use these props, borrowed from the Scarecrow, to give the Batman a vivid, practical lesson. Soon, Schiller's figure reappeared in the Morrison district. He knew Bruce would be back. That was the kind of man he was. Where he fell, he had to personally raise that ground to dust. It was his innate pride. The Morrison district was small, just 6 labyrinthine alleys. The spot where Bruce had fallen was at the entrance to the first alley, home to a nightclub run by the Gutter Gang. The Gutter Gang was a typical Gotham syndicate. They were fond of dumping their victims' bodies into the stinking drainage ditch that ran alongside the district. In time, Gutter became their moniker, a name they wore with pride. The one to defeat the fledgling Batman was no legendary villain, just a group of thugs smoking cheap cigarettes on the nightclub roof. A lack of experience had led him, after dispatching most of the enemies, to be blinded by an unexpected handful of lime powder. Stumbling, he had plummeted from the rooftop. The early Batman had no assistance, and his equipment was crude. A humbling defeat in the gutter was not surprising. But the Gutter Gang's luck had just run out. Schiller leaned against a wall at the end of the block and lit a cigarette. Before long, a series of shrill, terrified screams erupted from the nightclub, then abruptly ceased. The Gotham night returned to its customary deathly silence. An insignificant little gang had been quietly erased from the city's map. A moment later, the tall figure of Batman emerged from the shadows, in much better shape than last time. His head was bowed, as if he were still replaying the details of the fight, calculating how to improve his equipment. Suddenly, he remembered something and strode deeper into the alley. He was looking for the beggar huddled in the corner. He planned to give her some money and tell her the Gutter Gang was gone, that she could leave safely. He found the figure in the same spot, still wrapped tightly in a threadbare blanket, shivering in Gotham's damp, cold air. The umbrella Schiller had left for her was gone. Batman held a wad of bills out to her, speaking in the intimidating, deliberately low voice he had adopted. "There are no more gangs in this district. You're safe." The beggar trembled and slowly raised her head. But in her clouded eyes, Batman saw not a single shred of gratitude. He watched in disbelief as a single emotion surged in the eyes that stared, transfixed, upon him. A bone, deep hatred. Aren't you happy?" For the first time, his voice was laced with confusion. "Of course he isn't." A familiar, cold voice drifted down from above. Schiller stood on the balcony of an apartment overlooking the alley, gazing down at Batman with an air of playful pity. Because of the Gutter Gang's presence, that nightclub thrived. Patrons, full from their meals, would carelessly discard their leftovers, and those scraps, those half-eaten morsels, were what this beggar relied on for survival. Schiller's voice was unnervingly clear in the damp air. But now, the Gutter Gang is gone, and the nightclub is closed. No patrons means no food. But several $100 should be enough for. Batman's voice was hoarse, laced with a struggling uncertainty. "Indeed, you have access to the finest medical care in Gotham, private doctors and health consultants on call. You have likely never experienced the misery of a simple fever, let alone conceived of what it feels like to be frozen to the point of being unable to move." Schiller drew out his words, savoring the moment like a connoisseur tasting a rare wine. In your world, he could simply take that money to a supermarket, check into a warm hotel, perhaps even see a doctor. But unfortunately, he cannot even take that first, simplest step. Batman knelt, his hand trembling as he pulled away the filthy blanket covering the man's legs. Beneath it, his lower limbs were a deep, deathly purple, grotesquely swollen from prolonged immersion in the rainwater. Batman was well versed in surgical theory. He knew at a glance that the tissue was completely necrotic. Even with the most advanced medical technology Wayne Enterprises could provide, the only outcome was amputation. He fell utterly silent. The dollar bills scattered in the muddy water now seemed like a grotesque mockery, a suffocating, shameful joke. An uncontrollable rage, a tidal wave of negative emotion, surged through him, consuming his reason. He wanted to roar. He had never felt so undone. Batman staggered to his feet, retreated a few steps, and finally collapsed into the cold, filthy water. Evidently, an unexpectedly tragic outcome, catalyzed by the faintest trace of fear toxin, was more than enough to mire the young hero in a bog of self, doubt for days to come. Gordon loosened the top button of his shirt, twisted his neck to relieve the stiffness in his shoulders, and stared out the window at Gotham's dark, rainy night. It was the same cold, the same dampness. His colleagues exchanged greetings as they left the station for the day. One of them patted Gordon on the back. "Hey, man, you never should have taken that thorny case. Dozens of missing persons. You'll probably be buried in files until midnight again." Gordon gave a weary smile. "Like you said, dozens of missing persons. I have to give it some attention." After his colleagues had all left, Gordon brewed himself a strong, black coffee. He planned to work through the night again. The missing persons case in the Morson district was exceedingly strange. In previous cases, no matter how covertly it was done, the bodies of some victims would eventually be found. But of the 46 people who had disappeared, it was as if they had been erased from existence. This was profoundly unusual. Gotham had never been a city that abided by the law. Gangs were as common as cattle here. No seasoned gang member would go to the thankless trouble of disposing of a body. They would simply toss it from a building. They knew it wouldn't fool the police, but in Gotham, the police were a joke. The dozens of people who had vanished from the Morson district came from all walks of life. They had almost no common pattern. Their only link was that they were all permanent residents of the area. At this time, Gordon was still young, just a minor figure in the police department, a long way from being commissioner. This hot potato of a case, which no one else wanted, had ultimately been taken on by the rather righteous Gordon. Though he knew it was likely to be a thankless job, he was still determined to do his best and seek justice for the victims. As he was sorting through files late into the night, exhaustion washing over him, he suddenly heard a sound behind him. He spun around to see a massive shadow looming over him. Gordon immediately reached for his hip, but his gun wasn't there. The person opposite him was clad in a black tactical suit with 2 pointed ears on his head and a sweeping black cape. He was tall, almost completely blocking the light from overhead. Gordon spoke cautiously. "Who are you? Why are you in the police station?" "You can think of me as a vigilante." The figure's voice was a low, processed growl. "I'm investigating the disappearances in the Morson district. I saw you went there. You must be the detective in charge. I'd like the files on these missing people." Just as Gordon was about to refuse, the man spoke again. "Of course, I have clues I can exchange with you. Or perhaps we could solve this case together." A vigilante, Gordon thought, that's absurd. If such a person existed in Gotham, it wouldn't be known as the City of Sin. Their first meeting was not a pleasant one. The newly arrived Batman had not yet mastered the art of concise communication. He and Gordon remained at a standoff in the empty office for a long time before his patience finally wore thin. Batman realized he was truly unlucky. There were countless derelict cops in Gotham, yet he had run into the most dedicated one. Gordon seemed ready to protect those files with his life, and Batman, having no desire to harm him, was left with no better option than to retreat into the night. After the humbling encounter with the beggar, Batman had been deeply shaken. He had ultimately arranged for the man's care, but he had also begun to reflect on his own methods, deciding to be less grandiose and to start with the simplest of things. The Morson district, the starting point of his crusade, was not peaceful even with the gutter gang gone. The number of missing persons had reached a dangerous figure. Batman was determined to make this case the true start of his mission. And, of course, he had a prime suspect. A university professor, awake in the middle of the night, sneaking into a gang-infested district of Gotham, appearing and disappearing for no reason. Could there be anyone more suspicious? Batman had considered confronting Schiller directly, but he knew he was unlikely to win a battle of words with the professor. He felt he had to have sufficient evidence before bringing him to justice. Tonight, Batman returned to the Morson district. Unable to get the files from Gordon, he broke into the home of one of the missing individuals, hoping to find clues. He had just climbed out of a window when he saw Schiller's figure again. Under a streetlight not far away, Schiller was once again holding a black umbrella, looking at the opposite wall. Batman saw him. He noticed Schiller was staring at the place where the beggar used to be. The spot was empty now, marked only by a dark stain on the wall where the beggar had leaned for years. A small puddle had formed there, reflecting the dim yellow light of the streetlight. Schiller stood on the other side of the road, gazing at the puddle, his thoughts unknown. The young Batman finally lost his composure. He dropped from the shadows, landing silently in front of Schiller. "Good evening, Batman. I remember that's what you called yourself last time, so that's what I'll call you." The eyes under Batman's cowl stared intently at him. He said, "Don't play games with me. You know why I'm here. You're here to be a savior. I know. For instance, you saved a poor beggar." "Were you responsible for the disappearances in the Morrison district?" Batman asked, his voice a low growl. Schiller shook his head. "You are the only outsider," Batman pressed, "and you have no legitimate motive for being here." Schiller chuckled softly. "Clearly, you already have an answer in your heart. Why do you still come to ask me? You are always so good at turning what you have already decided into a question for others." His tone grew sharper. "If you get an answer you're satisfied with, you'll naturally be content. But if you don't get the answer you want, you'll become very angry. If I say I'm not the killer, you'll be angry, but your anger doesn't come from your sense of justice, but simply because I didn't give you the answer you wanted." Schiller took a step forward. "You think you're infallible, don't you? I said, don't play games with me. You are the only one here who's a suspect." Before Batman could finish, a razor, sharp batarang, flew past Schiller's neck, embedding itself in the wall behind him with a thud. It seemed he had underestimated his opponent. The Batman of this moment, like the future Dark Knight, did not kill. But he never hesitated to break bones. This time, however, Schiller did not flinch. A second batarang followed, precisely slicing the skin of his neck. Crimson blood welled up instantly. Just then, a furious shout and the sound of running feet came from the end of the alley. "Freeze!" Batman whipped his head around to see Gordon under the streetlight, his service pistol raised, the dark muzzle aimed directly at them. "Detective Gordon, good evening." Schiller's voice was calm, as if he weren't the one bleeding. Gordon advanced slowly, gun held steady. "Drop your weapons. Nobody move." Schiller held up his hands to show they were empty. Batman silently retracted the batarang in his hand. Only when Gordon got closer did he see that blood had already soaked Schiller's collar. Schiller looked at Batman and said slowly, "You've made a mistake, Batman. You said I was the only suspect, but the detective here clearly disagrees." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Besides myself, there is one other person here with no motive to be here, you." "I'm here to investigate the disappearances," Batman countered. "As am I," Schiller replied, a mocking curve to his lips. "But clearly you are no more noble than I am, because neither of us is a police officer. I believe the only person with the authority to conduct an investigation here is Detective Gordon." "I will find the evidence," Batman said, his voice thick with frustration. "If you also need evidence," Schiller asked suddenly, "then what is the difference between you and the police?" The question struck Batman's chaotic thoughts like a bolt of lightning. He had always seen the police as inept precisely because they were bound by the need for evidence. He had become Batman to transcend those impotent rules. But if he too needed evidence to act, why not simply become a police officer? Conversely, if he didn't need evidence, if he could punish others based on suspicion alone, what was the difference between him and the very criminals he sought to destroy? Batman regretted it. He should never have engaged Schiller in conversation. Every time, the man effortlessly dismantled the convictions he had fought so hard to build. This assault on his mind and will was far more painful than any physical blow. After every encounter with Schiller, he needed days to process and fortify his resolve before he could put on the mask again. It felt exactly like being in a university class, where the professor posed one unanswerable question after another. On the other side of the street, Schiller was complaining silently to himself. His damnable colleague, Jonathan Crane, was an absolute lunatic. Stealing most of his fear, toxin hadn't slowed the man's research at all. On the contrary, it had spurred him into a frenzy of kidnapping new test subjects. And now he had to spend his night cleaning up the man's disastrous mess. Compared to Schiller's incisive, predatory aura, his colleague, Jonathan Crane, looked like a harmless saint. He was thin and lanky with a messy thatch of curly hair and a pair of heavy, black-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. The dark circles under the lenses made him look frail, like a bookworm who had never seen the sun. His reputation on campus was that of an affable pushover. Every student at Gotham University knew that Professor Crane never took attendance, and his exams were laughably easy. Even if a student was late or left early, he would simply adjust his glasses, gently ask them to take a seat, and never utter a word of reprimand. In stark contrast, the new psychology professor, Schiller, seemed like a dangerous element who had just been granted an honorary lifetime membership to Arkham Asylum. Schiller's features had a certain depth, a hint of mixed heritage in his black hair and gray eyes, all of it framed by a chilling demeanor. He seemed to have fully inherited the aesthetic of this body's previous owner. His wardrobe consisted of nothing but black and gray. The styles were severely monotonous, always an overcoat, a scarf, and a perfectly tailored suit. Gotham's incessant, dreary rain meant he was almost never seen without a long, handled black umbrella. If this man wasn't the final villain in a television drama, it would be a profound disappointment to the audience. It didn't take long for the students to experience Schiller's rigor. His lectures were undeniably brilliant, but his disciplinary standards were draconian. Lateness and early departures were all recorded, and pop quizzes were a frequent occurrence. He had even announced in his very first class that the failure rate for his course would be no lower than 30%. In an instant, every student who had signed up for his class was on edge, as if preparing for war. Many of Gotham University's students came from wealthy backgrounds, so rebellious streaks were common. At first, a few tried to challenge Schiller's authority, but soon someone leaked his terrifyingly impressive resume. Overnight, the atmosphere in the classroom underwent a dramatic transformation. Those once defiant students were now as quiet as lambs to the slaughter. After all, how could a normal person, at such a young age, have been deeply involved as a consultant in so many sensational serial murder cases that had shaken the nation? Soon, Schiller became the newest campus legend at Gotham University. Some said he was the true mastermind behind those cases. Others claimed he carried a curse, and that bloodshed was sure to follow wherever he went. The more imaginative ones invented a tragic past for him, claiming he only studied criminal psychology to seek revenge against some mysterious enemy. Bizarre and terrifying stories always have a way of capturing the curiosity of the young. Within days, tales of Professor Schiller's glorious deeds had spread throughout the entire campus. Now, when Schiller went to the cafeteria for breakfast, the line he chose would instantly empty, with students only daring to watch from a safe distance. And in his classroom, the homework submission rate had reached an unprecedented 100%, an achievement no other professor had ever managed. Ever since that confrontation in the Morrison district, Schiller could clearly feel a gaze following him in the shadows. Even during the day, on campus, that stare was a constant presence. It was Bruce. Thanks to his spider sense, Schiller had repeatedly foiled the young man's attempts to plant listening devices and cameras in his dormitory, clinic, and lecture hall. This, however, gave Schiller a new idea. It seemed the young Batman still hadn't managed to let go of his obsession, but it appeared he and Detective Gordon had reached some sort of understanding. During a late night visit to the Morrison district, Schiller discovered the two of them were actually investigating together. Another night, as black as ink. Schiller had no plans to go out. The demands of university teaching were far more draining than he had imagined, and with students genuinely in need of help occasionally visiting his psychology clinic for consultations, he was physically and mentally exhausted. He just wanted a good night's sleep. But fate had other plans. Jonathan, who usually only became active in the dead of night, broke his routine and slipped off campus in the early evening. Schiller knew what that meant. He was off to capture new guinea pigs for his insane experiments. It was no wonder he was so agitated. Gordon and Batman had been turning the Morrison district upside down lately. Jonathan knew that with a physique even less imposing than Schiller's, he stood no chance of resisting if he were caught. As Batman cleaned out the gutter gang and a few other minor syndicates, stories of a mysterious vigilante began to circulate in Gotham's dark corners. Jonathan hadn't dared to show his face for several nights. But his fear toxin research was at a critical breakthrough. No true fanatic could tolerate an interruption at such a juncture. His test subjects were all used up. He had to replenish his stock. Despite his physical weakness, capturing ordinary people was not difficult for him. Find a house with an open window, insert a flexible tube, pump in a large amount of anesthetic gas, then pick the lock and drag the unconscious person away. Simple, efficient. Schiller watched his furtive figure disappear into the night and sighed with resignation. He put his coat back on and picked up his umbrella. He was no savior with an overabundance of saintly compassion, but he couldn't just stand by and watch a tragedy unfold. More importantly, if Jonathan kept this up, the Morrison district would soon be a ghost town. Wouldn't that bring Batman's debut show to a premature end? The Scarecrow was destined to be sent to Arkham by Batman sooner or later. There was no time like the present. Besides, Schiller had prepared a little surprise. It was time to teach that arrogant young hero another unforgettable lesson. The Joker was still just a clown in some great circus. The Batman of today still had room for error. Schiller didn't dare to imagine how cruelly the young man would be toyed with if the Joker were to appear before him now. Though young, the skills Batman had acquired on his global pilgrimage were not merely for show. And the Jonathan of this moment was not yet the meticulous criminal mastermind he would become. He lacked surveillance awareness and had left far too many loose ends. Soon, Batman and Gordon followed the clues to the basement of an abandoned chapel in the Morrison district. This was Jonathan's laboratory. It was less a laboratory and more a filthy, clandestine workshop. It was dim, cramped, and filled with an indescribable, cloying stench. Batman's eyes fell on a rust-stained drainage pipe in the basement. "I think I know where the missing people went," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Gordon, gripping his pistol, walked over with a grim expression. "I hate to ask, but my report has to state the facts. Aqua regia, Batman stated, it can dissolve metal, and, of course, the hardest parts of the human body." "All right, I get it. Spare me the details." Gordon cut him off immediately. They meticulously examined the den. Suddenly, under a dilapidated wooden crate, Gordon found something that didn't belong. A few tattered, mud-caked leaves. North American red pine. Batman identified it instantly. "I see it's cotyledons." "What the hell?" Gordon frowned. "Where in all of Gotham City are you going to find a pine tree?" "There is one place." Batman's voice became laden with meaning. "Gotham University. It has the best green spaces in the entire city. The main thoroughfare is lined on both sides with this exact type of tree." Gordon knelt, examining the traces carefully. It must have been stuck to the killer's boots. The rain these past few days has made the ground soft. When he came here, the dirt must have fallen off without him noticing." He looked up at Batman. "The killer is a student at Gotham University." "Or," Batman said, a hint of barely concealed satisfaction in his voice, "a professor." "Is it the man you threatened that night?" Gordon asked. "I wasn't threatening him, but you cut his neck with a batarang. He bled a lot. A wound that long is bound to leave a scar." "Are you sympathizing with a criminal?" Batman's tone turned cold. "He's not a criminal until he's been tried." "A trial," Batman began, his voice dripping with scorn.